we'll kick off and start the webinar. All right, massive thank you to everyone that joined today live, and hello to everyone who's watching the recording. For anyone who hasn't seen me before or who doesn't know me, my name is Clara. I'm an organizational psychologist and yeah, consultant psychologist here at CiC. My passion is absolutely around mental health and well-being in the workplace. So I'm really excited to deliver today's webinar on change, recognizing opportunity and change. Before we kick off, I also just wanted to mention that Jake, my colleague, is on the call today helping me out. So please feel free today to put in any questions you might have, either in the chat directly or through the Q&A, and Jake will help out at the end to make sure that we go through all of them. So please feel free to type as much as you feel comfortable in typing in the chat. I really want to make sure that today is as interactive as we possibly can make it. So to kick off, change, and talking about how can we recognize opportunity in change. We're going to explore a little bit what change is and also identify sort of how can we seize it as an opportunity rather than seeing it as challenging, because change is a constant in our lives, right? Whether it's to do with our personal lives, whether it's to do with our professional careers, or even on a broader context, right? Sometimes it can relate to our health, friendships, so on and so forth. Change, generally speaking, can feel quite daunting, right? But it can also bring a lot of potential for growth, for positive change, for innovation, for creativity, for new relationships, new experiences. And I recognize that it can be difficult, right, to see that, especially at the start of change, to see perhaps, you know, that positive light. But today we'll talk a little bit about the experience that we may have in going through change, both emotionally and physiologically, and then talk about how we can shift a little bit our perspective and see it more so as an opportunity to our advantage rather than something that may be detrimental to our lives. And yeah, as I said, throughout today's webinar, please feel free to type into the chat any comments, questions. I will be asking you guys a couple of questions throughout, so hopefully I'll get some of your thoughts. But yeah. So to kick off, I think it's important to recognize our natural response to change, right? And to sort of challenge it when we find it to perhaps be unhelpful. Generally speaking, you know, in today's modern world, we're exposed to an increasing number of change and of unexpected events, you know, with the introduction of artificial intelligence, of media, of social media. All of these things are really shifting the way that we not only see the world, but also experience the world. It's also an extremely fast-paced lifestyle, right? So things that maybe once, you know, used to change and shift over quite a significant amount of time, suddenly things are changing overnight. And having to process that can be quite challenging. Generally speaking, as human beings, change will threaten our fundamental human needs. Some of you may have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which sort of recognizing that as humans, we have, you know, fundamental human needs like food and water, but also psychological and social needs, right? Having that feeling of belonging, having a sense of security, of finances, and of self-esteem. And change will impact these in a variety of different ways, right? Both in terms of our safety, in terms of our feeling of security and of certainty of how things are going to happen and how things are in this moment in time. And there is really no psychological safety, albeit in our lives or at work, without that sense of safety, right? Personal safety and social safety. I feel like I've said safety quite a few times there, but that just sort of emphasizes the importance of it. And there are many different types of change, you know, as I mentioned a little bit in the introduction, but also change can be something that we're planned, right? We might know that perhaps we are quitting our jobs and deciding to travel for a year, or deciding to shift careers, or perhaps changes in the organization. We're aware that they're going to happen and I'm going to be a part of it. So it's almost that anticipatory stress and anxiety that we might experience, right? Um, and also change can be something that can be quite sudden, but also be more gradual over time, right? And therefore, it's almost more like a marathon approach that we have to take to it, something that we have to deal with on a longer term basis and day by day change the way we see it. Um, so yeah, start thinking already now and start reflecting about all the different changes that you might be experiencing today. You know, there's 156 of you here today. I'm sure all of you have come here today with something that perhaps is on your plate, on your mind that you're experiencing. Um, I, I just see someone has written in the chat, you've asked your 15-year-old twins what their hierarchy of need is, and it's Wi-Fi and passcode. Yeah, I kind of agree. I fully see that. If there's no Wi-Fi, I mean, what am I going to be doing, right? Um, so the psychological effects of change can be many, many different things, right? All of these things that you see here on the screen are completely normal, and it's completely valid to experience them. Um, you know, I think change often triggers quite a range of emotional responses. So it's very natural to experience some anxiety, some stress, especially when facing the unknown. But also equally, it's possible and it's normal to experience excitement and anticipation and that positive feeling. And often, actually, anxiety and excitement almost interlock sometimes, and it's really difficult to understand which one we're experiencing. So it's important to slow things down, understand these emotions and how they might fit into the change curve that we'll talk about a little bit later on. So I'm curious to hear from you all, right? You know, I've shared a couple here on the screen. That fear of the future. Often there's worry about financial or job stability. You know, there's a lot of shifts at the moment in organization. You know, a lot of organizations are going through redundancies, which can be an extremely stressful period. Even if you have that safety of, I know my job is safe, there are changes ahead. So yeah, thank you. I see a couple of you already sharing. I appreciate that. And feel free, you know, to share, do any of these resonate with you, or is there anything else that you're experiencing? Um, Someone has shared changes to immigration policies in the UK, yeah, and worldwide, right? That can feel really, really challenging as someone, perhaps if you identify with a person with a background or a culture, or a minority group, and suddenly you feel that you've been stripped away of a security, and sitting with that can be quite difficult, you know, and connecting with others and creating a community feel is one way that we can feel in some ways supported and connected to others that do value you as an individual. Yeah, someone has shared redundancies in the NHS. Absolutely. Currently, that's an issue. Someone has shared change really dysregulates and panics me. Any type, but usually I can cope. Changing my health has really impacted me now, though. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's difficult to have to sometimes come and, you know, say these things even to ourselves, right? Um, and I'm curious there, you know, maybe ask yourself, what are the things that help you cope? And we'll talk a little bit more about later how we can do that. But sort of start reflecting on that, right? Although there are many different changes, you know, both in terms of your health and perhaps other areas that do panic you, what are those small things, however sort of small or big they are, that help you manage? Because those are the things we really want to be focusing in on. Health seems to be a big one, absolutely. Worrying about workload ahead, especially if colleagues are going to be made redundant. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that anticipatory concern, anxiety definitely comes in there, right? Where we start to naturally, of course, we're going to catastrophize, which is a completely normal human response, right? Our mind starts racing. We might feel quite a lot of pressure on our chest. We might feel like our breathing changes, and feel a little bit stuck. Someone's mentioned ever increasing wars around the world. Yeah, you know, are we concerned about World War III? These are things that are so outside of our control that, of course, are going to sit and worry us. And that's why we need to really bring it back to what is within my sphere, what is within the realm that I can actually manage. Someone's mentioned being crashed into by a car whilst walking in the office. You know, I'm so sorry. That sounds like an extremely difficult um, situation, and I hope you're okay. But again, that health aspect seems to be coming up quite a lot. Long-term health conditions, unemployment. Lack of clarity. Yeah, someone's mentioned that. You know, the one thing, and we'll talk a little bit later about how managers can support teams, is how can you keep teams also informed in what's happening throughout change? Thanks. So many different comments there. I can't go through all of them, unfortunately, but quite a few there. And you know, I see a lot of you also reacting to each other's messages, and that's also a really important thing that I want to mention. Through change, peer support, if that's within an office environment or even within your families, friends, colleagues, that is going to be essential in creating that sense of safety between you all. You know, you may very well not be alone in how you're feeling. So sharing that with others is going to be crucial to be able to manage the psychological, the emotional, and the physiological reactions you may have to change. So yeah, big thanks to everyone for sharing. I appreciate it. You know, there are different ways that we can respond to change. And, you know, I've shared on the screen here some of the more typical responses, the more default responses we find in individuals in terms of responding to change. You know, a lot of individuals will do nothing, almost become quite numb to what happens around them. And that's quite common, right? We often withdraw. We often don't really want to face that change. Often, you know, we sort of end up in a state of denial. Um, in other situations, we may think the worst, and this tends to be perhaps if we experience a little bit more anxiety and maybe catastrophized situations. And this is very much a safety, survival mechanisms that we have as human beings, right? We tend to fall into this mindset because it allows us to think about all the possible worst case scenarios in order to make sure that we can achieve survival, right? And that's kind of ingrained in our systems. Staying optimistic, and you know, I kind of put a question mark there because that can be positive, right? In the way that if we're being realistically optimistic, but also it can be unrealistic, right? If we're sort of ignoring the reality of things. So just being conscious about what's my perspective over this? Consulting others, right? And being able to connect with others and talk about it, and then making plans that are realistic and that are helpful for me. So again, you know, to you all, I'm curious, do you have any of these defaults? Does this sort of support you and lend to be a positive way, or perhaps not so much? And how do you think you may be able to shift that? I've noticed someone has just said, I normally try to stay optimistic, but so much that has been happening lately that's made that harder to do. Yeah. And I think that's really challenging, right? If you're generally quite an optimistic person that tends to try and see the glass half full, etc., when you sort of notice yourself changing your mindset, that can also be quite a strange and novel way of feeling and of thinking, right? And I think that's completely okay. That's completely normal. You know, in some ways, it's also perhaps being a little bit more realistic about situations. And I would really just invite you to not judge that thought and that feeling, and to connect again with others around you. Someone said some of the responses can be phased though, right? In the beginning, you might think the worst and have no energy to do anything, but then might transition to consulting others. Absolutely. And that will lead me on to exactly the change curve, which is essentially the experience that we go through. It's a model that kind of helps us understand that emotional journey that we go through in face of change, right? It was actually developed to describe the stages that we have of grief, you know, when we're grieving for someone's passing. But it can actually be adapted, or it was adapted to fit into various different contexts, including that of organizational change. Yeah, some other of you have mentioned around thinking a lot of different things when negative things happen, doing nothing. And I love that someone's mentioned doing nothing, but I'm here because I realize I need to shift that. That is so empowering, and that's beautiful that you've recognized that. I'm really, really happy. Absolutely. And if anyone resonates with that, you know, you're here, you're already taking that first step in thinking, okay, what is it that I can do to support myself? So if I'm looking here at the change curve, I can see quite a few of you probably resonate with different sections to this. What would tend to happen is at the start, we sort of have that initial shock, right? And that's where sort of we really, when the change has occurred, right? From that shock, sort of that first introduction, we tend to experience surprise. So if we're thinking an example about maybe we're hearing about a major restructure in the company, or we're hearing about a redundancy, we then fall into the state of denial. Right? After this initial shock, we might think, no, 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 I'm refusing that. That's not going to happen. It's not really going to come to fruition. It's just talk, right? It's just gossip. And we might actually dismiss that restructuring perhaps as a rumor, right? We then fall into that resistant stage where we really sort of we understand the reality of it. We recognize that it's going to happen. We feel quite a lot of frustration, but we really want to sort of push this away, push the reality of it away. We often fall into sort of a state also of depression, and there's different curves that indicate different stages. One of them is sort of that depressive state where we understand that it's actually going to happen. We think the worst, we catastrophize, and we feel like everything is outside of our control, which I see quite a few of you have mentioned already. When we enter this state, we through support can enter that explorative stage where we think about, okay, something's going to have to change. It's going to happen. There's not much in my control. What is it that I can do to make my situation better? And then we go into that commitment stage where we've accepted the change, we've grown into it, and we've changed the way that we have worked as a consequence of that to really integrate it in a successful and positive way, to improve our day-to-day well-being, but also performance, etc. Now, one thing I want to mention and highlight is this isn't sort of I go through stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4, and I'm out of it. That's it. I'm good. I'm done. We may fall down, go up, come back down, go back up, and have a consistent change, right? This isn't a linear step. So if you find yourself finally committing or finally accepting the change, and then, a couple of months down the line, you feel like you're back in denial, or you're back in that depressive state or in resistant state, that's okay. That's absolutely normal. Don't beat yourself up, right? Acknowledge that that's exactly what's sort of expected to happen within this change, because there may be some more additional things that you weren't aware of at the beginning. Someone has just mentioned me as a peer and a supporter of people with mental health difficulties. I learn into focusing on how I can help others. Yeah, that's beautiful. And again, that peer support, right, is massively empowering. Just creating a space often to be listened to, right? Or, as human beings, we just want to be heard. We want to be acknowledged. We want to be seen. And if we can create that in an environment in the workplace where a peer supporter is really just taking that time to just say, I'm here, tell me, how are things going? And then being able to signpost them into the right direction is extremely empowering. So I think it might be helpful to also just thinking about what are some of the things that we might hear. And I sort of invite you to think about for yourselves and for your colleagues, right? If we're in a state of anger, we're perhaps saying things like, why is this happening to me? Who is to blame? Maybe we're in a problem solving stage where we think about what do I need to do to make things easier for me? So that's probably a much more sort of committed stage. Maybe we've accepted it. So I'm at peace. Yeah, I accept what's happened. In a more so depressive state where I think I don't care about anything. I'm too sad or I'm too frustrated to actually act upon this. Or in a denial. No, this can't be happening to me. I don't accept it. Or perhaps in a bargaining stage where we think, well, perhaps if I do this, then maybe the change won't happen. Now, as I mentioned at the start, there's a variety of different ways that we might experience change. I've shared here on the screen a little bit of an overview of them. I think one of the main things is definitely the way that we're working. Look at us today. There's almost 200 people on the call. I'm sat in an office and I can connect with everyone. So that hybrid working has really change the way in terms of how we interact with others, how we work, the expectation, the amount of time we're expected to be behind the screen. And we've sort of just molded into it, right? So I'm curious, what else have you experienced in terms of change? I know you've already mentioned a few of them, but how has this impacted you specifically? I'm just going to read out some of the things I've also just noticed here in the chat. Always asking someone if they're okay and asking a second time. Yeah, you'll find the reality of the second response. I think that's a really powerful message you've shared there because, as a British individual, we're really good at just saying, hey, how are you? Are you okay? And responding, yeah, I'm good, thanks. How are you? It's sort of ingrained in our culture to just ask that, right? So if we can ask twice and really, looking at that person in the eye and making sure that it's a safe space in which they feel like they can respond, they may feel comfortable enough to open up. Someone's just said, I started a job where I can work from home. This was a big change, good and bad. I love that shift of perspective, both good and bad. And I think it's important within that, right, and thinking about these types of change, understanding why is it that we resist, right? We've spoken a little bit about that internal sort of human need of feeling safe, feeling certainty. But it's also changing our routine, right? Perhaps we've had a routine before that we really enjoyed and appreciated, and suddenly everything has shifted, right? Even if it's just changing houses, right? It's a positive thing. Maybe we've recently bought a beautiful home somewhere. Even that can be quite overwhelming. Loss of control, perhaps everything beforehand was within my remit, and maybe if health changes or job changes and suddenly I don't have that control. We may feel threat, we may feel emotionally drained, or perhaps also impact our self-esteem, right? Has something changed even within us that has changed the way that we then respond to others around us? So just noticing and recognizing all these things. And I would really invite you all to sort of jot these down if you have the time and just notice maybe some of the patterns that you're experiencing. You know, I think also bereavement comes into this. I see some of you have mentioned that, if you've lost someone close to you in the family, that's going to significantly change the way that you feel as an individual. And that's going to be very hard to sit with. I like to bring a little bit of science into this, just because of my background, but also because I think it's quite interesting. There was a behavioral study conducted in 2019 where they essentially looked at humans and primates, and they were taught to complete a task and rewarded for this, right? So if they were able to complete the task, they would then reach their goal and receive a reward. Interestingly enough, they then were shown a shortcut to be able to reach their goal, right? However, what they found was that primates were significantly more likely to adopt this new and more efficient shortcut to achieving their goal, which in this case was food, whilst humans, although they understood how to achieve the shortcut, it took them much longer to actually accept that shortcut and use this new strategy. In fact, almost 1/3 of the human participants still resisted and used the old approach, which I think is an extremely interesting piece of research to suggest again that, it's also, while even though we're aware of that shortcut, we're aware of that thing that might be, helpful to us in a way, that change is more overwhelming to us than actually that positive outcome. So, I think in some ways this can be reassuring, right? That it's almost ingrained in our DNA. So perhaps not blaming ourselves in these situations if if it's taking us quite a while to respond to that change and to adapt to it. Think back to this research and think, well, this is me. This is what sort of my internal system is pushing me towards. So thinking about also resources and change, right? What are some of the things that can help us in respond to change? And, I want to start also inviting you all to share a little bit also in the chat. What are some of those resources that help you in times of change to be able to process this, right? In reality, a lot of them are practical things, right? If we've got enough money to be able to support ourselves in that time of change, is it time? Have we got time to process it, to deal with it? The support around us, right? Family support, even from afar. Yeah, someone has mentioned that. Technology has allowed us to be able to connect them. Communication, extremely powerful. Just being on top of things, just being aware of what's happening. Talking to a trusted friend, therapy, beautiful. Someone said my manager tries to ensure I have prior notice of change to process it. Fantastic. Someone's mentioned change of scenery. And all these things can have a significant impact in our perspective of the situation, how we view it. Long walks, beach, please. Yeah, I agree. Beach or mountains, anything in nature, absolutely. So many different things. And with the resources that I have, ask yourself, can I face the situation? If the answer is yes, we're more likely to embrace the change. And if the answer is no, we're going to be more likely to retreat, be angry, or resist this change. So I really invite you today in thinking about, okay, if I feel like I don't have that support, if I feel like I don't have that connection, where is it that I can find it? Where can I create that community around me? Quite a few of you have mentioned a little bit about pressure and stress and increase in workload. And so I think it's important to talk about the link between uncertainty and pressure, right? Naturally, we'll have a negative reaction to uncertainty and to that change. And that's invariably going to add pressure to our everyday, right? This pressure that we experience as stress with a resilient attitude can be positive, can be effective, can be helpful, but it can also be felt negatively. And this is that unwanted stress. So if we're thinking about the stress curve, we need stress. I'm not here to be angry at stress. Stress is important, but it has to be managed, right? So, I think it's important to recognize, where are you in this moment in time on the stress curve? Do you find that the demands that are placed upon you are being managed by the resources that you have, right? If that is the case, you may be sitting around this area or perhaps performing and feeling fulfilled by your challenges. But if you'll find yourself creeping into this area, think about, what are the things that I need to do to ensure that I'm taking care of myself and reducing a little bit of that stress that I'm feeling. Stress can be experienced in many different ways. And, again, feel free to share in the chat, what are some of the things that you've noticed? But some of the first signs that we can recognize, especially in times of change, is that irritability, sleep problems. Sleep is one of the main things that we often ignore, but is one of the main things that can support us in times of change and in times of difficulty. It impacts us really in a sort of complete way. We've got lack of concentration, withdrawing from social support. Some people have mentioned doing hobbies that really enjoy can help you. Someone said overeating or undereating, so changes in terms of our hunger. Insomnia, splitting headaches, yeah, lots of different things there. And so, it's fantastic that all of you are writing these down, and I really invite you to recognize these in yourself or in others and raise them, bring them to your attention or bring them to the attention of your colleagues, and just share, I've noticed these changes recently. How are things going? Right? Sometimes it is just about asking that question and just saying, hey, how are things going with you? And so I want to move on to sort of how you can support your teams as a manager, but also just your colleagues in general. This is an adaptation of the change curve. And it really helps sort of understand a little bit about the different stages whilst you're going through the stages of change, how an individual within a team may experience that, and how you as a manager or as a team member can support them. So the most important thing to highlight is communication, is clarity, right? Within the first step, we really want to ensure that your team or that your colleagues are informed of the changes that might be around you. So make sure that you're perhaps increasing the one-to-ones that you have. Communicate the why, the when, and the where, or how things are going to change, right? Often what we find is that the one thing that individuals within organizational change experience is actually not so much the change that they're struggling with, but the fact that they didn't feel like they were a part of it. Next up, whilst they're falling into the stage of sort of anger, bargaining, or depressive state, they might be quite emotional. So ensuring that we're supporting them, being empathetic and actively listening, right? Being present and showing that you care about them and that you value their emotions and everything that they're going through. Ensuring that they get that communication, but also feel validated in terms of how they're feeling. And once you find that they've managed to come out of that state of depression, and maybe you start seeing the first stages of acceptance, is really about directing and guiding. Often what we need to be able to manage the change is almost be part of it, and to support them in giving them in some ways that guidance and that direction. So, if yourselves are managers, or perhaps even just colleagues within our team, think about what are the things that you can do perhaps with other people in your team to support them. Someone's just said, it's difficult as a manager if you have to make someone redundant. They will likely feel that any attempt to be empathetic is fake. Yeah, absolutely. And I think in some ways that's understandable from their perspective, right? And that's where I would really sort of emphasize being as genuine and being as clear and realistic as possible, right? Talking really about the facts also, and just ensuring that things aren't too vague, because often that can create that feeling of fakeness. Someone has shared empathy counts for a lot of people close to me, just to say you'll be okay, when valuing my emotions would actually be more helpful. Yeah, absolutely. Often when someone says to you, you'll be okay, they don't really know if you're going to be okay, right? What I really want to hear is just that sort of validation of that sounds like it's really difficult. I'm here to listen. What is it that I can do to help? And sometimes even just asking that question, what is that one thing that I can do to help? Get them almost to give the answer for you. So how can we be proactive and rather than sort of reactive to change, right? And the key to this is really about seeing change as an opportunity rather than a threat, right? We may experience some of that feeling of threat, right? Unfortunately, our bodies aren't able to distinguish between real threat and perceived threat. But it's really about slowing things down and being able to recognize this as an opportunity. We can do this in a manner of different ways, and I've shared a few here on the screen. Becoming more alert and curious. I think I really want to highlight that, being curious about what's happening around us. Thinking about the bigger picture rather than really sort of having those, I can't even think of the term now, but really a one sort of way of seeing things. Perhaps can we broaden our spectrum a little bit and look outside of that box? Also, I think beforehand, expecting things to change, knowing that not everything will remain the same forever, right? Change is a part of life. So if we sort of have that acceptance when it does occur, we're sort of in a better position to deal with it. Trust your instincts also, sometimes in face of change, being able to trust the way our gut and what it's telling us to do is important. Being ready to adapt, again, goes hand in hand with that expectation. Thinking about the opportunities that it can bring, so even just writing them down, I think that can be helpful. Celebrating the small changes that also feel good and focusing in on them. Developing new ideas and approaches, and building resilience, which we'll talk a little bit about later. I can see already of you are so much sharing in the chat around that proactivity. And some of you have shared being curious is extremely helpful. Someone has said, don't take the change personally. Yeah, extremely powerful. Thank you for mentioning that. Often we will make that a personal thing because we think it is directed towards us, but often it is completely irrelevant that we will experience that change as a consequence of it, right? So really trying to remind ourselves and even sort of affirming that we are valuable and that we are needed. However, maybe this isn't the right space or the right situation is important, right? And we can do so in many different ways. I know currently there's a lot of sort of gratitude journals and all these different things that can really help validate those beliefs. Someone has shared this isn't easy, but trying to speak to yourself the way you would support a friend going through the same experience. Great suggestion. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's an extremely, I think, helpful tool to have. Thinking about, would I say these same things to a loved one? Would I say these things to one of my siblings or one of my children, or even just a colleague, right? Or what would I say to them if they were saying things like that to me? Someone has said curious, not nosy. Yeah, or maybe even a little bit nosy, right? I'm trying to get as much information as possible for my own benefit. Someone Someone has said, I'm learning to try and be kinder to myself, especially with new disability and future now going to be very different. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Kindness is something that we often forget to have for ourselves. We're kind to other people, but remembering to be kind to ourselves can sometimes not really come to the forefront as much. So slowing things down and taking the time to do that, 100%. Um, Someone has said journaling, it can be really helpful. You mentioned building resilience, but how does that work? Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about resilience next. Someone has said, I'm facing possible redundancy, and part of me wants to use that as an opportunity to pursue my creative interests, but this isn't financially stable, so it feels stupid to do so. I can completely empathize with the fact that that may be how you feel. And I think there it's perhaps thinking about, okay, there's a reality of it to this, right? We have to be realists in terms of having the financial stability of having a job, but also pursuing something that makes me feel good. So thinking about, is there something that we can sort of find a middle ground there? The reason for that is because if we can persist and do activities that make us feel good and make us feel competent and able, that's going to allow us to actually improve our well-being, and as a consequence of that, be able to find perhaps the new job that we have a little bit more something that we can deal with on a day-to-day basis, even if it may not be the one thing that we want to pursue forever. So being able to keep those two things might be helpful. So a few of you have mentioned a little bit about resilience, and before we jump into it, I'd love to hear from you all. What is the one thing that you think of when we talk about resilience? I've kind of thrown the term around a little bit. I'm sure you've heard it being thrown around a bit, but what does it actually mean to respond to change with resilience? Does it mean to just constantly be positive? Yeah, thanks. Someone has mentioned coping. Absolutely. So being able to survive, yeah. Maybe survive but not thrive at the beginning, for sure. Someone has said, how do you react to a situation and manage yourself? Beautiful. So how do I manage myself internally, emotionally? Not getting overwhelmed by changes, tenacity. Being able to sit with the uncertainty, beautiful, yeah, acknowledging it, feeling it, but still being able to keep going, beautiful. Yeah, lots of really amazing suggestions there. Thank you, guys. And that's exactly it, right? Resilience is the ability to adapt to change positively, recover from the difficulties, and persist in face of challenges. It's not about never experiencing stress. It's not about constantly being on top of everything. It's really about, okay, I recognize this change, this shift. How am I going to grow? How am I going to learn from this? How am I going to adapt from this? And I think really, Darwin's quote here is exactly that, is it's not the strongest of species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. I think that's extremely powerful. How can we do that? Well, first and foremost, it's about control, right? If we think about the circles of control, can really help us ensure that we're building that feeling of, okay, whilst everything around me may feel like is outside of my control and is changing, focusing in on that one thing that is in my control, or those two small things, can really not only improve our perspective on general life and on the change, but also our overall well-being, right? And that's really important, I think, for us to build and continuously keep that resilience. I've seen, sorry, a question that I think is very important to raise. Someone has mentioned, can you lose resilience? I feel I used to be resilient and now I'm not. Resilient is something that fluctuates, like many different things in life. But recognizing that it's something that you do build, and you can, in some instances, feel a little bit less resilient, absolutely, and that's completely normal. So just thinking, I can build this, right? Acknowledging that it's not that you're either born with it or not, which I think could be quite reassuring for some. Also engaging in resilience building behaviors. I've put here some resilience depleting behaviors, but thinking about those that actually are helpful to us. I've put these on the screen here because I really just want you to sort of start reflecting and thinking about, do I perhaps fall into any of these, right? Do I actually start withdrawing? Do I have a lack of boundaries? Do I worry about things that are completely outside of my control? Do I ruminate? right? Do I do certain behaviors also, like we spoke a little bit before about changes in eating habits, not sleeping enough, perhaps abusing alcohol or drugs, all these different things that are not going to build our resilience. And thinking more so about the things that do build our resilience. You know, we can do that through self-care. As a clinician, self-care and boundaries are probably two of my favorite words. And I know it may sound frustrating or sort of too easy, but it is really sometimes as simple as that. I know I've said this before on some webinars, but International Self-Care Day is the 24th of July because it is 24/7. We should be engaging in self-care every single day, 365 days of the year. So take some time to think about, you know, if you notice yourself withdrawing from others, I see quite a few of you have mentioned that. What are the things that I can do maybe that I really truly enjoy? Some of the hobbies that I find really passionate about that maybe connects me with others, right? So I feel comfortable in doing that. That can slowly build a little bit of that sense of community, a little bit of that sense of, okay, I have some control over this, and also can build that self-care, can build that well-being. Um, so yeah, I'm curious to hear from you all, you know, how do you engage in self-care? I know, I'm sure there's a lot of perhaps dog owners, so walking perhaps your dog in the morning or being out in nature, um, perhaps prioritizing sleep or hydration or exercising. Yeah, thanks. Someone said I like to read. Beautiful. And I think reading brings you into sort of this whole other world, right? Which is fantastic. Dancing, yeah, I 100% agree with that. I feel like when you're dancing, again, you're only really thinking about that, which can really help. And it's also physically quite demanding. We've got the gym, we've got walking in nature, being creative, listening to podcasts, having a bath. Yeah, beautiful. Crochet, fantastic. Swimming outdoors, journaling, jigsaws, so many different things. I love this slide because I always try and find the most creative and unique self-care strategy because, you know, I'm asking for a friend. I'd love to try some new ones, but it's always interesting to see that. I've got pottery, shopping. Yeah, I'm very good at shopping. I can definitely do that. But yeah, amazing. So many different options. I should try some of these out. So yeah, if you find yourself perhaps, you know, not prioritizing your self-care, can you perhaps dedicate 5 minutes in a day, right? I recognize that, you know, some of you probably have very busy schedules. You may be full-time at work, parents, perhaps taking care of an elderly parent. You've got to walk the dog, then you've got to pick X person up from school, and it can just feel like a lot, right? And we sort of end up putting ourselves at the bottom of the list, and I completely understand that happening. So perhaps take some time to think, okay, can I wake up 5 minutes earlier today? just to just to sit with myself and just be able to perhaps meditate or to color in my coloring book if that's something that you enjoy. Whatever it is, remember, resilience is something that we take time to build. It's not going to sort of just improve overnight. Unfortunately, we do have to put a little bit of that time and energy. The positive thing of that is that we can do it with things that we enjoy, right? So we can build it with things that we find helpful. Lastly, before we go into some Q&As, make sure that you're not going at this alone, right? Change is scary, change is overwhelming. Make sure that you're reaching out. Talk to your colleagues, talk to your family. If you have access to the EAP, reach out to your managers and to us at CiC, right? You know, it's really important to just get the conversation going because I can assure you, you know, as I said, there's almost 200 of you here on the call today. There are many people in a similar, if not same boat. So if someone speaks up, someone else will appreciate that. That being said, making sure that we're taking care of our boundaries and respecting that. You know, ensure that you're maybe clarifying your own boundaries and respecting those of your colleagues and your friends, right? Especially in the face of change when things are uncertain, just being careful about how I'm communicating things or how I'm also experiencing things and bringing other people in, right? Um, Last but not least is the digital Ellie platform. If you have access to that, you can also access all the registrations for our future webinars. So if you haven't had access to Ellie already, do take a look at it if you can through your organization. It's very much like a Netflix style user experience. And as I said, you can also access all of our future webinars on here. Before we go into Q&A, I only have one piece of homework for you, and this is it. What is one thing that you're going to start doing from today onwards? What is one thing that you're already doing very well and that is really being helpful to you? And that could be self-care, that could be boundaries, that could be communication, and you're going to continue doing. And what's one thing that you're going to stop doing that you may find actually is not really so helpful to your well-being in this moment in time through the change that you're experiencing? Big thank you from me, from everyone here that's connecting, or for anyone that's watching the recording. We've got around 10 minutes now for any questions which you may have popped in through the Q&A, or that I may have missed in the chat, and Jake's here to support me with that. Jake's also going to post some polls, which would be fantastic if we could get your responses to that. But yeah, massive thank you from myself in the meantime.
Clara, thank you very much. The good news, I guess, is that you've not missed a single question. You did a fantastic job of keeping up with the chat. I'd like to say as well, it was an incredibly informative webinar. The proactive nature of change as well is something that I really alluded to personally, and I could see throughout the whole of the session, as you just saw as well, loads of comments, loads of supportive pieces of examples of things we can do to help each other. It was really lovely to read. So thank you to all that have engaged, but please do get any questions that you've got in. Clara's still got, as she said, 10 minutes to answer all your questions, and I'm sure she'll be really, really looking forward to anything that you've got coming up. And we've got one, Clara. How can you help children with change is the first question.
Yeah. Beautiful question. I think the first and foremost thing, which kind of goes for anyone, children or adults, is really asking those open-ended questions and then actively listening to what that person has said, right? So I know that can be sometimes a little bit more challenging with children. Kids often aren't as communicative or fearful to communicate. So ensuring that, you're creating a really safe space and just giving sort of that, I'm here to listen. I'm here to support you if you need me. I recognize that this change that you're going through is very challenging, or that you're going through as a family is very challenging, and that it's completely normal to feel, in any way that perhaps they're struggling, and really just creating that open door to be able to talk about it. And then when they do open up, recognizing some of the things that they may have said, some of the words they may have said, and asking them to expand on that, really, because that just shows that you really listened to what they've said, and that you're also curious to understand. And lastly, validating that, understanding it, recognizing it, perhaps even not understanding it, actually, saying, I hear you, and that sounds really difficult. What is it that I can do to help, right? Asking again them, if there's anything I can do, I am here for you. And that just gives the permission to the child to be able to say, actually what I need is this or that. So I hope that somewhat helps.
Thank you, Clara. Another question that has come through then. Would you say not sharing information on the change or explaining to everyone, so brackets, especially those not directly involved, is a way of setting up a boundary?
Yeah, beautiful question. And I would say absolutely. I think it's important to communicate, and I'm not sure if this has come specifically from a manager or perhaps a senior leader. I think information is important, but sometimes less is more, right? It's just about ensuring that the right information is shared, and not really keeping things from individuals that, if they were to find out would significantly impact their well-being. So it's a delicate balance, and of course it's going to be a little bit of a case-by-case situation. And what I would invite you to do is not sit with that by yourself, But reach out if you do to the manager advice line if you have access to that, or to other managers that you may have a closer relationship with, to be able to sort of just say, look, I've got the situation, I'm not really too sure what to do with it. It's important to not sit with this by yourself, because I think that can also be quite difficult.
Thank you, Clara. We've got a few more questions hopefully coming through, but whilst we wait for them, some people have put their action plans into the chat as well, so I'll read a few of them out. So, yep, start doing, recognizing when I've coped with change in the past. They're going to keep doing physical activity to get out of their head, and they're going to stop doing assuming change is always negative.
Beautiful. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Really appreciate it. And I think recognizing also that it's going to be easier said than done, right? Not every day is going to be fantastic. Not every day we're going to be able to perform and get everything done 100%. But that is absolutely okay. Recognizing again that curve that we may fall into acceptance and then back in denial, and then we want to bargain, etc.
Right, thank you, Clara. And another action plan that's came in, start doing Share Ellie with their team. They're going to continue doing self-care and personal development journey, and they're going to stop doing allow others to make them second guess their intuition and resilience.
Yeah, amazing.
Lovely.
That's fantastic. Thank you.
Another question is slightly separate. They were hoping to attend the Building Community for Mental Wellbeing webinar, but couldn't due to a meeting. Do you know of the recording, Clara?
Yeah, absolutely. So yesterday we did a session on community, given that it's Mental Health Awareness Week, and that is the topic of this year. It was recorded and it will be uploaded onto YouTube. So just a matter of sort of editing and uploading that, and it should be on there soon. But yeah, do take a look at our YouTube channel. We've got lots of different recordings on there of past webinars. You can register to all of our future webinars on Ellie. And next month, I believe, is Wellbeing in Families. So I know quite a few of you online here today have mentioned children. So if that's of interest, please do come along. It'd be great to have you there.
Thank you, Clara. And in addition to what Clara said as well, for those of you that have attended today but would like to watch this webinar back as well, same situation, needs to be slightly edited, but as soon as it's available on YouTube and Ellie, we'll let you all know. Clara, we've had another question. What can we do for those who remain focused on the past and struggle to move on?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think if we're talking about yourself, I would say, how can we change the questions we might be asking ourselves? I really find it quite helpful to write them down, quite literally write the question and the answer. If it is instead with a friend, a family, or a colleague, reflecting that back onto them, saying I've noticed this, or I've noticed that. I've noticed you mentioned quite a few things about the past. Is there anything that you're thinking about the future, or is there anything about today that you find empowering or helpful or positive? And again, with all these questions, they have to come from a very genuine, non-judgmental place, which I know can be easier said than done. And if you find yourself not being the right person to ask those questions, can you direct them to a peer supporter, right? Can you direct them to someone else who maybe perhaps has a better relationship with that person, to try and get them to think about a different perspective? Thinking about the past is very much a safety mechanism that we have as human beings. It allows us to not make the same mistakes or not make the same sort of decisions in the future. And so also normalizing that and allowing ourselves in some way to think, okay, it's okay to do that, but actually also thinking about the present and also in the future may allow me to think in a more positive light. Thank you. I see someone's also shared the YouTube link, which I appreciate. Thank you. Beat me to it.
Yeah, they've done a great job, Clara, the participants. The YouTube link, how to access Ellie, it's all there as well. We don't have any further questions, but I just would like to read you out some of the action plans we've received as well, and a few other separate comments. So someone said they're going to start using mental wellbeing and overthinking journal daily. They're going to continue ensuring hydration, and they're going to stop focusing on things outside of their control.
Beautiful. Yeah, that control bit, honestly, it's so empowering once we've come to that acceptance in a way that we can only control so much.
Right. And the other final comment that we have as well, we are living in a very interesting times, which at the macro and micro level is extremely unsettling. So where we are usually looking for a safe haven, it's really challenging at the moment. Have you got any thoughts on that, Clara?
Yeah. Yeah, it is really challenging. I think first of all, it's important to recognize that, and that I'm sure a lot of people will feel very similar to you. The one thing that I have found empowering and safe in a way, especially in these times that are extremely unsettling, in many areas of the world, is finding communities that I connect with on an emotional, on a personal, on a social level, where I can be my genuine, wholehearted self, with no judgment, with no pressure. And, that circle can be as small or as big as you want it to be. And I think just creating that safe space is really crucial, to not only respond to that need of community, but if it can also respond to the need of, um, engaging in perhaps a type of hobby or something that you really enjoy doing, it builds that sense of self-esteem, of that positivity, of that sense of there is positive out there. There are good things, right? And I know, again, that's easier said than done, but there are those groups out there.
Thank you, Clara. And I guess we've got time for one final question that's come through in the chat. They were called sensitive in the negative way when they tried to set up a boundary with someone. Is it worth working with this more to ensure the boundaries are met, or should they just leave it?
Yeah, wonderful question. I'm sorry that person called you sensitive. I think it's important to then think, is this a boundary that I need and require? Is this important to me? And if the answer is yes, then I would commit to that. If that's important for you as an individual to function, if that's in your personal life, in your work life, I would respect that. And perhaps this person is not the right person to have in your life in this moment in time if they can't respect that boundary, right? Now, naturally, I can understand that might be difficult to say in a work environment. It's probably more applicable to a social setting. But if it is within a work environment, perhaps communicating this with other people in your team or with your manager and trying to talk through that situation, right? Maybe it'd be helpful to get a different perspective of the situation. But I think generally speaking, your boundaries are your boundaries and you're allowed to have them. And yeah.
Thank you, Clara. And that concludes all the questions. So I'll let you conclude the webinar for those that have attended.
Great. Thank you again so much for everyone who attended today. And I wish you all a lovely rest of the day.
Cool. Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everyone.